Welcome to our episode today. We are here to talk about the science of stretching and about stretching myths. And Travis and I wanted to focus on this topic today because this is in the movement fitness world in general, but especially in the yoga world. It seems that opinions and feelings about stretching, they've kind of changed over time, and things have shifted from everyone being super pro stretching these days to being a little more maybe anti-stretching, specifically anti-passive stretching. There's quite a bit of fear mongering out there in the yoga world. Some yoga teachers even say that they've stopped teaching passive stretching. Their beliefs that it's injurious, and just other fear mongering ideas about stretching that are out there. So we kind of wanted to, within that context of knowing the lay of the land around stretching these days, take a closer look at like what stretching really is, a little bit of the science behind stretching, and maybe some common myths that we have in our hands out there in the yoga movement and fitness worlds. And so in order to do that, Travis and I actually invited a very special guest on the podcast with us today. And we get to welcome Greg Lehman to this discussion. And Greg is someone who both Travis and I have admired Greg and his work for a long time now. And I think I can safely say that we both consider him a really huge inspiration, him and his work, a huge inspiration to us. So for those of you who don't know who Greg is a clinical educator, a physiotherapist, which in the US we call that a physical therapist, a strength and conditioning specialist, a chiropractor. He travels the world teaching his Reconciling Biomechanics with Pain Science course and his Running Resiliency course. And his work has had a profound impact on the therapeutic fitness and movement world. So we're really honored to have Greg with us here today. Thank you so much for being here, Greg.
Sweet. Thanks for the kind words. That was a nice intro. I should have well, you did record it. Never mind. I'm stealing it.
You can use that.
Script it.
It's good. You're good at what you do.
Gosh, well, thanks for saying that. Well, it's all true. I mean, gosh, yeah. We're so happy to have you here.
All right.
So we wanted to start with a tweet that you had brilliantly laid out a couple of weeks ago, and I'm just going to read it to give the context, and then I'll give you a question related to it. So what you said in the tweet was, "I am just amazed about how much fear-mongering and movement pessimism there is around static stretching. It's such a vanilla exercise. It's like worrying about the right way to tie your shoelaces. Most of the concern comes from myths about what it actually does, which isn't much." So my first question, just to give some context for the listeners, is can you define static stretching? I know that's kind of maybe a simple question, but specifically, like when you talk about static stretching or when you were referring to it in that tweet, were you thinking more about passive static stretching only, or also like active static stretching with PNF types of things?
Well, both, but I mean, most people think of it as pretty passive. Where it's just where you go to end range and hold it, so not adding contractions of the agonist or the antagonist, but there's no real difference. It's just stress at end range. That's it. Like what's active? Like if you say you do a leg raise and you pull your foot up, you're lying on your back and you pull your leg up all the way. Is that active because your hip flexors are pulling you into it? Do you know what I mean?
I would think so. Passive for the hamstrings, but
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like the hamstrings don't really know. They're just being pulled on. But if someone pushes your leg, that would be passive, but you're probably helping them a little bit as well. Or if you drop your heels off a stair doing dorsiflexion, is that passive? I mean, you're still working eccentrically. You can't help but control that a little bit. So like we just have these like kind of arbitrary definitions here. And I think if you're like a tendon or a muscle being pulled on, you're like, I don't know what's happening. I'm just being pulled on. I'm experiencing tension. That's it. That's why we don't really see a lot of difference between the different stretching modalities.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because something that I've seen you teach about before is about how because muscles attach to tendons, tendons attach to bone, when muscles contract, they are attempting to shorten, and that pulls on tendons. So that's like this tensile load that's lengthening them basically. And that's what happens in a contraction and also in strengthening. We don't tend to hear a lot of fear mongering about strength training, but when it comes to stretching, it's similar, right? Like stretching is also a pull on a tendon. It's also a tensile load.
Yeah. So if so you'll see people. So this is the idea. Someone will say, "Oh, don't stretch your Achilles tendon because it'll stretch it out and make it less stiff and elongate it." And they're like, "Oh, you need a good, stiff, healthy tendon." And I said that makes no sense to me. Like, why stretching would elongate a tendon? Because what we know, it does in the short term. There's viscoelastic changes, it heats up, and so it is less stiff immediately after stretching. It's also less stiff if you just go for a run or do calf raises. If it warms up, it's going to be a little bit less stiff, or plyometric training in the short term. So in the long term, if you load up an Achilles tendon with strength training, like doing heavy calf raises, in general, that tendon will become a little stiffer. Its mobility will be the same, but it's stiffer. It just takes more force to move it. So the load that's on the tendon is tension. You pull on that tendon and the tendon's like, oh my gosh, you're pulling on me. There's this stress. I better adapt over time to be stronger to handle this. But now if you do a passive stretch, like drop your heel over the edge of a stair, the tendon still feels pulling. It has no idea if it's a passive stretch or if you're actively contracting the calf muscle. All it knows is that it's experiencing tension. So the way that tendon responds to tension, if it's really heavy, is to get a little thicker and a little stiffer. So when you stretch a tendon, in the long term, it doesn't become less stiff. It doesn't really become stiffer because the load probably isn't enough. You need high loads to really make a tendon get stiffer. So that's what I mean by stretching is just kind of vanilla. It's just, it's a little pulling. I can handle this. I don't need to adapt. I'm not going to elongate, and I'm not going to get stiffer, and I'm not going to it's less stiffer. It's whatever. It's like going for a walk. That's what I mean. I don't remember saying tying your shoes, but I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, I guess. Must have been a little drunk. It was just like, you know what I mean? It's just like nothing. It's just not something that you should think about. I don't know why we worry about it. And we do it with hip capsules. I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent here. But same thing, I see it in the yoga world. People are like, oh, no, don't do a hip flexor stretch because you'll stretch out your hip labrum or your shoulder labrum or that really strong connective tissue. And I'm like, same thing, right? If you tear a ligament in your ankle, the way we heal it is by loading it. It needs stress on it to adapt. And the way ligaments in general, and we do need more research here. So, take this with a little bit of skepticism because this needs to be better tested. But in general, if you load up a ligament, it responds by getting thicker and a little bit stiffer. So that in an injured ligament. So why would the hip capsule lengthen? It undergoes tension and it says, oh my God, you're stressing me. I have to get stronger and thicker. I would say it can lengthen if you actually damage it. So if you that damage decreases stiffness. Yeah,
high
something.
Force.
Yeah, you see it in baseball players in their elbow, like that ligament will get a little less stiff. But in the back of their shoulder, where they're decelerating it and it's stretching every time they throw, that ligament in the shoulder and the posterior capsule gets thicker. So there is a research technique. You guys probably know Andrew Vygotsky. He does some of this with shear wave elastography. And maybe you can do this with your research, Travis. You can measure actually the stiffness of a ligament. I've looked for it. No one's done it. But I'd like to see if like a stretching program of the ankle ligaments where you go into inversion, like you're trying to sprain it, over the long term, if it actually makes them stiffer. So it can be tested. Just no one has done it. Yeah.
And could help like post ankle sprain or potentially help be protective against an ankle sprain,
so
maybe?
If you have a post ankle sprain, I load people up into the injury mechanism all the time. I want to stress that tissue. If you tear your hamstring, what do? We load up the hamstring. You protect it and load it so it adapts. So the same thing with the ligament sprain. And it's funny, that people are doing that now. Like you're going to see more research on that. I just saw some masterclass and I was like, oh, good. Vindication. He's great. He's just like me. I'm not so biased. That's so bad. I make those jokes like, this is a great research paper because it agrees with what I say. Sorry, that's bad science.
But easy to do.
Yeah, we all do it.
Well, thank you so much for God, you like dove right
Yep.
into it. Some of those were
That's all
some of the
right.
questions already. No, no, it's
I
good.
know.
It's really
I
good. These were
figured.
some of the questions we've been wanting to ask you. But yeah, I mean, you basically already kind of myth busted this, but I do feel like just kind of in the casual layperson's idea, we sometimes just tend to think because stretching is pulling on things that that's just inevitably and actually going to make things longer and lax inside of us. You know,
Yeah.
like a t-shirt, like you pull on a t-shirt throughout the
Yep.
day or whatever, and it becomes loose. People think that's what's happening to their tissues when they stretch. I think that's part of what's informing some of the fear
Yeah.
mongering about stretching.
You, you know what it's like? It's like that happens in the short term. If you stretch in the short term for the next half an hour, you will have more mobility and you'll be less stiff, right? But don't assume that that happens in the long term, because that was, say, if you do a strength training workout, at the end of the workout, are you tired and does your force production decrease? Absolutely. But
Yes.
no one would say strength training makes you weaker in the long term, right? But we do with
That's such a good
stretching.
analogy.
You're looser. Oh, in the long term, that'll cause a decrease in stiffness. Or like the same thing with when people denigrate passive stretching because it decreases the ability to produce force a little bit in the short term. You know, like power and strength decreases maybe 3%. Although if you look at Anthony Blazevich's research, he would say if that stretching is within a good warm up, those negative effects are gone. But anyways, like again, so just because you have a short-term change in force production doesn't mean it's going to make you weaker in the long term. That's what we do. We jump on inappropriate research and make stronger conclusions than we should. We shouldn't do that.
So, and such a good distinction. I think that people often don't appreciate that difference between acute effects and chronic effects, or short term versus long term, which Travis, you and I
Yeah.
talked about just recently in that episode on yoga
Hmm.
sequencing and like sequencing within a yoga class for a peak pose within the class versus sequencing to build strength over time and for those long term, more chronic adaptations. I think that distinction often isn't appreciated. It makes so much sense. That is partly why things can get confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So if we've sort of talked about now what static stretching doesn't do. So and you know we have these preconceived notions about the ill effects, but what does it do?
Yeah.
Or yeah.
That's a good question, and it's actually really interesting. I should start with the stuff I don't know a lot about. Surprisingly, it can improve vascular health. That's one of the areas I want to look into. There's a number of research papers where somehow it helps with the vascular system, which is kind of neat.
That's very
And then
cool.
what it does more in the mechanical world, it certainly increases mobility, right? So you'll have static stretching, do it every day. Not even to the point of pain. I like that research where you don't have to beat the crap out of yourself. You just have to go to the point of first stretch sensation. That's what they call it, where you start to feel the pull, maybe a little bit beyond. And if you do that regularly, you'll have an increase in mobility, often 15 to 20%, depending on the joint. And then what it does, this is sort of the long-term debate, and this is where I was very anti-stretching 20 years ago, because people are saying, oh, if you stretch, it'll decrease the stiffness of the tissue, and then that will change your posture or something like that. And I didn't like the posture
Right.
research. And then so Magnuson came out with a paper in 1998, and he said, well, stretching might increase your mobility, but it won't change the stiffness of a joint. You guys have probably heard that idea, where like that there's no structural change, but you can go farther. So the argument there is that's a habituation argument, where you just get comfortable being uncomfortable, or you get comfortable at end range, and then your body, or you can handle the discomfort and you can just go farther. So that was Magnuson who started that. However, since then, a number of researchers have said actually there is some structural changes. It's not just the nervous system. And then what Blazevich has argued, again, he's a great researcher, and Marie Multebach, she's Norwegian, they have argued that there might be some structural change in the muscle, where the muscle might become a little less stiff, but the tendon doesn't. So what the tendon... Sorry, I'm going to blow everyone away. This is the coolest thing, and you're going to have to just look it up. There's something called hysteresis in a tendon, meaning like as you load it, it stores energy, and when you unload it, like relaxing, it loses a bit of energy. So And what stretching does is it changes the hysteresis of the tendon, meaning after long-term stretching, the tendon, this is so cool, doesn't lose as much energy. It's more efficient in the unloading. Less energy is lost as heat. That's Kubo's research from like a decade ago. It's fantastic. It's so neat. Yeah.
So cool. So the tendon can like return more energy, like in terms of recoil?
I think
Like
that, but I don't
stretch
know
and
if people have.
recoil.
So like that's studied, the way they study that is you contract your calf muscle and then they measure the tendon length, and the harder you contract, the more the tendon will undergo stretch, like or strain.
Oh,
And then
okay.
when you're, and then so on the relaxing part, after long-term stretching, it doesn't undergo as much strain. So technically you would say it's a bit stiffer. And so they're saying that's less energy loss. But what no one has done, like that, where it would be interesting if you took a runner or someone jumping and bouncing and you gave them like a long-term static stretching program, would that correlate with less, like more efficiency? That's where the rubber meets the road. It might show up on a lab test. I don't know if it shows up experimentally. I do know of some studies where people do static stretching, like bodybuilders do it, and you'll see improvements in strength gains. I just don't know. And it's greater in the group that stretches. So you do see some neat pragmatic research like that.
Sorry, for me at least the audio cut out just a little bit, but were you talking about like interset stretching when you're talking about bodybuilders?
Yeah, that stuff. Yeah, I know the research is mixed. I don't know it off the back of my hand, but I have seen some studies where you'll see static stretching increasing strength gains. I don't know the mechanism, and I do know of some other pragmatic studies where people static stretch for the long term and they measure sprinting and jumping, and you'll see tiny changes in performance.
Improvements.
Yeah.
Right, which
And I was like,
just
how
seems
does
so
that make sense?
counterintuitive.
No, I know. You won't see everyone not like I used to knock stretching and distance runners based on the small decreases in absolute force performance in the short term. But in the long term, it's not like we have evidence that people who static stretch, they decrease their efficiency. Although if you read a Runner's World article, it will tell you that not to do it. But that's what I mean. People are blowing up the research and it's not there yet. When they do test people and they have them static stretch and they measure running economy, it doesn't change running economy. So I don't know.
Is that partly kind of like why you said in your tweet, stretching doesn't necessarily do much? Like it's just
Exactly. In terms of all the negative things, if we just did it for what it was intended, which was to increase mobility, it's great. But we've shit on it for all of these other things that aren't supported. You know?
right.
Like I wrote an article 10 years ago telling people to stop foam rolling their IT band, like if you wanted to make it, longer or whatever. And people are still like on Instagram doing these posts pretending like they have this advanced knowledge, like the IT band doesn't stretch. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't permanently elongate, right, with stretching or foam rolling, but neither does any connective tissue. Like there's no insight there, like no connective tissue. Do we have any evidence that any connective tissue permanently elongates with foam rolling or static stretching? But temporarily, it certainly stretches. Like the IT band, when you go into hip adduction or internal rotation, I think, and maybe some extension, it will undergo strain, meaning it stretches in the short term. And that's cool because it stores elastic energy and then it releases it. And that's how we ambulate. We're always storing and releasing elastic energy in our connective tissue. And stretching won't make you less efficient. And that's what people say. It's bullshit. It won't make us more loosey-goosey.
Totally what people say.
You always hear people say that. Oh, don't stretch. You'll lengthen your tissue. It's so bullshit. It's like it's like sitting in a chair for 8 hours. No one's like, oh, your glutes are going to get all loose. No, we say the opposite. How, you know what I mean? Like we say the hip flexors will get tight. I'm like, won't our glutes, like won't it make my squatting better if I sit in a chair all day? Because now I've loosened up my glute fascia. Like we have such inconsistencies.
Oh, inconsistencies
we worried
all over the
about
place.
we worry about 3 times 30 seconds static stretch holds.
Totally. As though it's going to have this like huge negative or positive effect. Yeah. 3 times 30 seconds.
That's what I meant. It's not worth worrying about. It's like worrying about the Krebs cycle. It's like gonna happen. It's just nothing. It's a physiological process, but who cares? It's just, that's what I meant. It's vanilla.
Right. It's
Yeah.
I think it's just that's like a really powerful word to use too, because everybody kind of knows what that means. It's just this, it's like harmless. And maybe it has
Yeah.
some positive benefits. I love how you mentioned the potential of vascular benefits. And
Yeah.
also stretching can have down regulation of the nervous system benefit, like
Sure.
de-stressing could help
Absolutely.
build a bigger cup if it's something that helps relax you and that you really enjoy doing.
Uh, Yeah, and then the reason people denigrate it, and me too, this was me 20 years ago, was there wasn't everyone was saying you got to stretch to prevent injuries. And the research said, no, that you don't have to. There's better things you could do. But here's the irony. When you look at some of the, no, it's not ironic, I'm like Alanis Morissette. So here's the other point.
Her song
It's,
does, it is. Isn't that ironic? But it's not ironic. The example she
yeah,
uses.
she's apologized. um, uh, if you subcategorize your injuries, and this is what Blazevich has done, I think David Bem, this research group, Malachi McHugh, they've said if you segregate the injuries into like acute like muscle strains, like with sprinting or ballistic actions, pre-activity static stretching might have a injury preventive effect or injury reduction effect. But it won't help like a distance runner, but it might help like a sprinting soccer player or something like that. So you have to like split up the injuries. It's not going to help an ankle sprain, but it might help a muscle tear.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're just as a broad category talking about whether stretching can reduce injuries, just all injuries, then maybe not so much. But if you
Yeah.
talk about specific injuries,
Exactly.
then yeah, for some certain specific types of sports, that I feel like that'd be mind blowing for some people to realize because there's
Yeah.
so much of that narrative out there.
They've been writing
It's
those papers
tricky.
for years.
It's tricky
Yeah.
because the initial recommendation was, oh, you have to static stretch before you exercise. That's going to prevent injuries. And then when the research came out without segmenting the different injuries, it was like, oh no, that's nonsense. Static stretching doesn't prevent injuries. So we're like, oh, we don't need to do it. But
Yeah.
then some smart people were like, oh, well, maybe we should actually think, what's the mechanism that this could occur through? And okay, it can't help. It's not going to prevent an ACL injury or an ankle sprain, but maybe for these specific types of muscle injuries, it could have an effect.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
That makes so much sense. Oh, sorry. Go on, Travis.
Well, yeah, one question that I think is really relevant for the yogis, like when we talk about static stretching in a strength and conditioning context, it is that 3 sets of 30 seconds. But when you're talking about especially some styles of yoga, yin, I think
Yin
is one of
yoga.
them where you actually are spending really prolonged periods of time. I don't know, 10 minutes in a particular posture and then maybe an hour overall. Like if that's all you're doing and it's not really an active flowing type class, is there any potential downside to that style of like physical practice?
I think what most people say, and they kind of change the topic a little here, would be like the downside is opportunity cost,
Right.
right? There's diminishing returns, and so and we see this everywhere. Like the tissue just stops listening after a while, so you don't need all that extra loading. We see with bones, right? Like if you want to build bone density, it's just like 10 hops 5 times done twice a day. But you do more than that, it just stops listening. It's like why runners don't have a lot of like extra bone density, even though they have all the impact, because after 5 to 10 minutes, stop listening. And so the work at Keith Barr would say the same thing with ligaments and tendons. Like, so the prolonged stretching, if your goal is to cause like, adaptations in the tissue or mobility, you probably are getting diminishing returns for that. But for the spiritual or the relaxation, but by all means, keep doing it. It's just what other health benefits aren't you getting? But you can say that about everything. It's like running. Running's not going to really make you stronger. You know what I mean? But people will still go and run 2 hours. Why would I shit on that person? But then people are like, oh, why do you do a hold it pose for 15 minutes? Well, why do you run for 2 hours? Because you want to, right? You know what I mean?
Totally, it makes you happy.
You run 2 hours, you could have got the same benefits unless you're competing for a marathon and running, half an hour, depending on. So ever knock that. So we're always, yoga gets
Gosh,
really
you're so right.
a bad rap sometimes. It's unfair. Like no one needs to squat 600 pounds, but people still do it.
But we admire that. Like that gets a lot of praise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's so true. And that, thank you for talking about that, about like, I don't know if the right word is like desensitizing to the load, but like ligaments and tendons, after not even very long time, they stop listening. And maybe it's just, there's kind of no point to going that long if your goal is the tissue adaptation. But like we said, there can be all these other reasons. Thank you for speaking. I think that I didn't realize that. So like a dose response relationship might be that you don't, like as with bone building activities, we just want like kind of shorter spurts, maybe more frequently
High frequency. Yeah.
But just to be clear, it sounds to me like you're suggesting that spending an hour in a yoga class where you're in one passive stretch for 10 minutes at a time, it sounds like you're saying you don't see that as inherently injurious or dangerous.
No, I have trouble. Like, so what? Like, why are we afraid of end range? The loads are so low. You're not like impacting. No one threw you from the roof into end range. Like, you know what I mean? You're just hanging out. You're just hanging out there. Like, so what? Like, I don't get it.
Why do people think they think it's so
tiny.
bad?
The stress is tiny. You're gonna adapt to it.
It sort of ties in with the whole active range of motion versus passive range of motion thing, where people are concerned about increasing their passive range of motion far beyond what they can actively control.
The gap.
Like a passive straight leg raise versus an active straight leg raise.
Yeah, the assumption there is that end range is injurious. And this is the neat thing about stretching. You guys know this, but people say, oh, you'll increase your passive range and then you can't control it during some functional task. The thing is,
right.
That's the issue with stretching. It doesn't carry over to functional tasks. You have to actually learn to use that new range of motion. We see this in runners. If you stretch your hip flexors, every day for 6 weeks, and then you measure how someone runs, they won't have more hip extension. Janice Moorside did this study, not in runners, but other things. And they increased hip extension on the table, but then they didn't use it when they did other tasks of daily living. So I don't know why people are worried about increasing their passive capabilities, because it doesn't transfer into any active capabilities. And not that I would even be worried about going to end range anyway.
I guess the idea is not that you would put yourself in it, but if some external force took you there, then you don't have any control over all of that extra range.
Here's the thing, though. You still do, because you're still strong. Because remember, if we don't change the passive stiffness, there's still going to be the passive stiffness will increase. Remember, the stretching doesn't change passive stiffness, so you're still going to get that resistance to going to end range, both passively and actively. Your muscles aren't stupid. You're going to have reflexive contractions.
The stretch reflex.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. I just don't see the concern of like
a lot of people do see that.
It doesn't.
Yeah. So the counter action to all of that is, we're not going to do any passive stretching in our yoga classes. We're going to make every pose active. So, and we're going to turn every passive stretch into some sort of contraction of an agonist or an antagonist. And that's like this new wave of yoga, right? And that there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it might not be necessary.
That's it. It's just options, right? I still think, looking at the mechanotransduction, heavy, like going into end range and holding it there, to me, it makes sense that it would make those tissues stronger and stiffer rather than loosier and goosier. I don't see the mechanism of how they elongate and become. I think people get comfortable at end range. I don't think it's really a big mechanical change. I think that's
like, so change. Stretch tolerance, is that the term?
Yeah, I think that seems to be the main thing. That's what they'll say. I think that long-term stretching, rather than change, it maybe changes the muscle function a little bit, but that's not inherently bad. I think people get comfortable, and a yoga practice like that does, it allows you to access your potential rather than creating something new. That would be my guess. It allows you to access whatever. Yeah, it allows you to access whatever your structure is capable of doing, rather than creating some new structure.
Oh,
to go.
whoa.
That would be my theory.
So
'Cause you'll have people
structurally
who don't- yeah, like
sorry.
there's some people like, so I'll give it like my ankle dorsiflexion. When I feel a stretch, I always feel pinching in the front. That's structural. Like that, I'm not going to wear down that bone, right? And same with my hips. Some people with their hips. Some people will have shallow acetabulums and tiny little like head of their femurs, and they're going to have lots of mobility. Someone else won't have that. So when they improve their flexibility gains, it's because their structure allows them to. Right. And then, and their body allows them to. They have both. They have the structural potential, and then their body says, I'm going to let you get there now.
Like the nervous system creates the discomfort later.
I don't know, but yeah, something, the black box of, whatever it is that holds them back.
In the black box. So are you suggesting that, like a practice like yoga or passive stretching, we had these potential ranges of motion available to us that we weren't accessing before, and that practice allows us to get there. So it's like we were, but then you said rather than creating something new, so it doesn't create new ranges that our structure couldn't allow.
It doesn't change the structure. Yeah, there's going to be a limit that everyone's going to have. That's why you shouldn't look over to the person beside you and be like, oh, I'll get there one day, because you might never have that potential to get there. And that's why I think good yoga teachers recognize that everyone has different structures, and then their limits are different. So you have to be flexible in your choosing of poses or whatever the ideal is.
Absolutely.
I got issues with ideals, right? It's not fair.
Totally.
Who is it based on?
Ideal movement patterns. Right. That makes so much sense. How do you think there's a way? You mentioned like in dorsiflexion, you feel like a pinch in the front of your ankle, and that kind of cues you to know that it's structural that's preventing you from going further. Is there a way you might recommend to people how to sense whether it is their structure limiting them? Maybe they don't need to keep hammering into that, or whether there's potential to go further.
I think you can still hammer into that. I think you can habituate. You might get a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with pinching. I don't know why
people would say that that's the closing ankle pain.
Right. So what?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess there's a difference between a pain sensation maybe and this feels like a bony block, but it's not painful. But Greg, you're saying maybe either way it's fine.
So I do back handsprings, or try to, and I was just doing not hamstring, but I was getting used to it last night, where I was loading up my wrist into extension, and I'm not going to get much more mobility because again I get the pinching with that, but I can get comfortable with that pinching. That's what I'm trying to do. That's the idea. And I still also wear wrist guards because I know I have a limit, and it's just I don't want to exceed it, but I like to do both. So I protect a little and I expose, and then the exposure just pushes the number of back handsprings I can do before I have to wear my wrist guards. Yeah. So same idea with any yoga practice.
You kind of habituate to that end range.
That's the idea. And at some point I don't habituate and I sensitize and I messed up. So then I just back off and wear my wrist guards more. That's it. Expose, protect, habituate, sensitize. It's always a balance. You're going to flare up and mess up sometimes. Work around it. It'll be fine.
Right. No need to make a huge anxiety deal about it.
Yeah.
Depends, totally. But movement optimism.
Totally.
So one question that would come to mind regarding all of this is if the idea is the idea that spending time in end range isn't necessarily inherently injurious or worrisome. Would you say that there is potentially an exception if someone has a systemic connective tissue disorder?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and I don't think so. I think it's the same idea. I'd have to know. I think their collagen. Well, yes, it might be looser and more lax. I still think that we should load it.
And stretching loads it. That's a load.
Yeah, that's the idea. And yes, do strength training, but and it's different. Sometimes they can get joint dislocations. That's fine. We would respect that and back off. But I still think they respond well to load. And you'll see it, like how many yoga practitioners actually have connective tissue disorders and are hyperflexible, and they're doing great, right? So it's not inherently
100%.
a strong stop. It's like anything, if you feel good, keep going for it, be confident with it, and I would also advocate
Absolutely.
strength training and all that stuff too, if joints are popping out, but if it feels fine.
I heard you say on the NAF Physio podcast, your guys' great episode about where you interviewed a
Kara.
woman about her. Yeah,
Kara.
who had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Yeah.
And I feel like I remember that you were talking about things like hypermobile joints and the ability to go further than, quote, normal ranges of motion when someone has connective tissue disorder like that. It's not necessarily that in and of itself is the problem. You use this great term, epiphenomenon, that like the hypermobility is an epiphenomenon of the greater systemic issue going on there. Yeah,
when people have pain, like it's not the hypermobility that potentially predisposes to pain, it's the sensitivity of the system, right? So when you have connective tissue disorder, there's often more anxiety and psychosocial stressors. We're not sure why. You could have like a more upset stomach or sensitivity to lights or migraines. So it's like they both are, it's all, the pain and all that stuff is parallel with the increased range of motion. It's not that the increased range of motion comes before the pain. They go together. And so that's what an epiphenomenon is, right? It's correlated, but it's not what's driving the pain or discomfort. It's all these other factors. They're both side effects. Pain, hypermobility is a side effect of something else.
That makes so much sense. And I think because the hypermobility is something that we can see with our eyes, and it gets associated with the just the general fear mongering in general about end range, I think people pull it out and kind of make it this target or a inherent problem. But it sounds like you're saying it's a side effect among many other side effects of this more systemic issue or condition going on. And so it's not necessarily inherently injurious to embody those positions. Your body can go there, and perhaps it could be helpful to load in those positions.
Yeah. I mean, of course, if it hurts, sometimes you have to make that call. Is it worth backing off? Or is it something I can habituate to, which is always the clinical challenge for everyone. Yeah. And certainly and with all my patients, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I think I was just going to say that in general, it's always still, not always, but for people with these types of disorders, it can still be a great idea to strength train and load with more load.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's just not necessarily that stretching is inherently a bad thing that we need to point our finger at.
Especially if they love it. That's the thing. I'm not going to take that away from someone. Oh gosh, how dare you stretch? You feel great stretching. Oh no, you're going to pay for it later, or you're causing damage to your joints and you don't know it. Like, the body isn't that stupid. They love doing it. Keep doing it. Gosh. I was like, oh, that's my one stress reliever, but I don't want to rip my labrum out or some bullshit that someone's told them. But I love it. Oh, okay.
That's kind of like, you call those their meaningful activities, right? That's kind of like the umbrella word that you use for anybody who's experiencing pain doing anything. It's like, we want to get you back to your meaningful activities, or you even say, let's resume your meaningful activities right away, right?
Yeah, let's do it today.
Even when they're causing pain.
Yeah.
Oh,
sometimes it's the right thing.
Totally. And it seems so important to identify and know what those activities are. And probably only in certain
handstands. It's always handstands. That's what I'm working on today. Handstands.
Travis and I wrote this article about end range training and some of the claims about it out there, and the active versus passive range of motion, and the gap, and the fears about if you passively stretch and you increase the range over which you can't control, then you predispose yourself to injury. And along with those types of claims comes these ideas of movement prerequisites. I don't know if you've heard of these, Greg, but handstand has like a perfect one, which is wrist extension. And there's this idea that you're like not allowed, or you haven't earned the right to do a handstand unless you can. There you go. So maybe you could passively get to 90. And we all know it's obvious. Obviously, you do need passive 90 degrees to do a handstand. I think that's pretty obvious.
For sure.
But if you don't have it actively, like if actively you only go to there, but you could still passively go to there, you would be forbidden to doing handstand until actively you can actively maintain 90. Do you know
Oh,
about that? Like
wow.
that's a thing.
Yeah, I think that's a bit dodgy. No, I've heard of those things. You see it in running. Like if
Yeah.
you're going to trail run more than 10 miles, you need to be able to do 50 push-ups. Like stupid.
What?
What?
Yeah, that's one. If you only run
That,
5K
wait.
on a road, you only need to push up from your knees. Like, because the core, it's a test of the core. It's silly.
Well,
So
it's
I
not
would
even a
never
good.
be able to
It's
do
not
a
even a good
handstand.
test of the core. So
Oh, I know.
that's
I know.
silly.
Yeah, that is silly. No, I mean, I believe in some prerequisites. It just has to be
Mm-hmm.
logical, right? Like I kept,
Mm-hmm.
you guys know, I kept tearing my abs doing backflips. And so the
Mm-hmm.
prerequisite, because the backflip was just on the ground, was just too far beyond the current strength of my abs. Sure. So I had to break it down and go do sit-ups and leg raises and hanging leg raises. Yeah. So there are probably some that are relevant, right? But you gotta make a strong case for it. Yeah, that
Yeah,
one's weirdly active. Yeah, I didn't get
that
that one.
makes sense with the backflip. Well, from the standpoint of you've actually injured yourself.
Yeah.
What was your limiting factor that was preventing you, or leading to this that you could work on to prevent future episodes of that injury? But to say like, oh, you don't have this, therefore 90 degrees of active wrist extension, therefore you're gonna hurt yourself. Like we can't say that at all.
So that's interesting. See, I would use handstand variations to build up
It's a
my
frickin'
handstand.
stretch, right?
Exactly.
There's no difference from me stretching here compared to me stretching in a handstand. It's still a passive stretch.
That's so
Yeah, so yeah,
true.
I used to improve my wrist flexibility by doing a handstand with my feet, my hands really far away from the wall, and I would do more of a back bridge. I'd be
Oh,
cranking on my shoulders and my back and my wrist. That was part of my warm up for back handsprings. I would use handstands to be like really get into end range at shoulder, wrist, and spine. If you saw, you'd be like, "Are you sure you're at end range? I'm at my end range, so screw you." But
that sounds like a
I identify with that as well.
yeah, okay.
really funny. But yeah, I mean, it seems to me like you would, if anything, you would help potentially prevent or reduce the risk of injury in handstand by just loading into handstand and doing handstand regularly over time and prep poses for handstand, but not necessarily pulling someone out of the whole pose.
Well, here's the thing: when you do a handstand, your wrists are still working actively. It's not even that passive. Those
Good
muscles are
point.
working a shit ton. Like you can't. Like
You're
that's the
trying
thing.
to stay upright, and those are
No
the
one,
muscles that are doing it.
yeah, no one like roofed you and put you into the handstand position. Like it's not really passive. Like you're not knocked out like with an anesthetic. So
That is
you know
such
what I
an
mean?
yeah,
Like it's
because your wrist
not even
flexors and
that passive.
extensors are.
Yeah.
Gosh, but people, it just, I think we get these like black and white ideas, like passive, active, like they're mutually exclusive and it's always one or the other. Just as with so many other ways that we have these binary divisions and labels for the body.
Like active wrist extension, that's just a motor skill. Like that, like why would, or it means you have really strong wrist extensors. It doesn't tell you anything about I mean, it tells you a little bit about the
Wow,
mobility on the other side, but you could just have really good skill. Like it's just, to me,
that's
I
so
bet you could
true.
train someone in a day to get more just because they get better at the position. So did you really change some structure or anything? You know, I don't get it. You're just better at it.
I don't get it either. Yeah,
Nope, me
I'm glad
neither.
we questioned it and wrote that piece. We'll have to put that piece in the show notes. But thank you so
Do
much
it.
for helping yeah, support that. So I kind of feel like we've covered just about all the questions that we
I want to
had.
ask. I want to ask one more thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you remember the paper from 2020
Oh
about
yeah.
I remember all of
retiring
them.
flexibility. Yeah,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
one made it. You
The
already know what I'm just gonna say.
James
Yeah,
Newso, yeah.
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 Retiring flexibility as a major component of physical fitness.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's the idea. Because we've elevated it, right? We elevated it to
Uh-huh.
It
something.
was a top tenner. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you had like as soon as someone says, "Oh, you have to have this," that's where it's dodgy, right? So
With
I do
anything.
like yeah, that take was nothing new. Like we've been running that for 20 years. But again, that doesn't mean don't do it or it's so detrimental. Yeah, that just
So
needed a counterpoint.
you neither everyone needs to do it nor no one
Yeah.
needs to do it. I don't know if I made those negative.
I
You know what I mean.
It's vanilla. It's vanilla. That's
Yeah.
it. It's a personal choice, right? Like it's just
one
it's
other
not,
hot.
yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It's just not a massive determinant of health, right? If you had to spend your time on health, like what will help the most people be healthy and have a longevity and be healthy when they're older, it probably wouldn't be flexibility training. I would guess that would be the idea. Although I don't know, once you, I actually find flexibility training hard. So,
It's a challenge.
it's odd. I think what James is confusing there is mobility as being related to future health, but the act of training for mobility might actually be beneficial because it's going to do more than just make you more flexible. Right? Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, like a yoga like is a yoga practice just, does that mean don't retire? I think you get more from a yoga practice than just mobility.
100%.
Right? So you got to be careful there. It's like strength training is great as well, but it's not necessarily great because it makes you stronger. It has other health benefits that have nothing to do with the ability to produce force. Right. So the same thing with flexibility training. So you just have to be cautious. Like, and I do too, of like saying, oh no, you don't need to stretch, but I'm like, yeah, but it gives you lots of benefits there. So maybe it is, oh god, now I'm just backing up. Maybe it is more than just vanilla. I just, oh shit.
Maybe it's like kale or something.
I love when you disagree with yourself, Greg.
It just happened.
One other.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, be careful of like judging something on the outcome you think is important, because there's other effects that occur. That's why pragmatic research is important. I'd love to see, like you see this in kneecap pain. People are like, oh, you got to strength train for the knee pain. There's a few studies that the control group is stretching and the other group is strengthening the hip, and there's no difference in kneecap pain. And you're like, what the hell? Even if their range of motion doesn't change. So it does something else. That's what you have to be careful about. Like we too readily shit on something because it doesn't achieve the desired target, but we don't know really what the important desired target is for a number of things. Yeah.
When that desired target is increased range of motion flexibility, I'm sure you saw there was a preprint. I don't know if it came out actually yet, but the one showing that there was no difference. I forget exactly the way the wording was because it wasn't that strength training was better at improving flexibility than static stretching, but it was as good, something like that.
Yeah, you got to look at the individual papers in there.
Yeah.
I had some issues with some of that, with some of the individual papers, and I don't know about that. I think if you have to strength train full range, that would help as well. But then that's stretching.
But then it's right. It's just a loaded stretch.
Yeah.
It is.
It's a convenient citation for us because we can be like, well, you can just strength train and then you know that's just as good for flexibility. But like you said, it's tough when you do meta-analysis in that way where you're combining papers that don't necessarily have business being combined.
Yeah, I swear they compared like ankle dorsiflexion stretches with doing eccentric calf raises. Like, well, an eccentric calf raise, some people will call that an ankle stretch. You know what I mean? Like, that's not fair. Or like a Jefferson curl for hamstring training. Is that a stretch or is that a strength training exercise? It's both. Yeah. So I'm cautious. I read that whole thing and went, I don't know. Dodgy.
I mean that speaks to like the bigger picture of the research. Trying to, and we've alluded to this, like trying to draw out practical applications of the research when the research is done in a way that isn't necessarily how the stretching is applied in practice. Like you take you hold a 20-minute stretch and then you show 5 minutes later that your strength is decreased or your power is decreased. It's like, but we only hold it for 15 seconds.
Yeah.
So like you don't have to worry. So that
exactly,
it's tough.
Yeah, and that Blazevich, that group, they've been banging that drum forever, right? You got to read their stuff.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Applying what they do in the lab to what we actually do, like what we see on a day-to-day basis.
We need pragmatic research. Yeah.
Makes so much sense. Well, I feel like with all of that, we've done a very thorough covering of this excellent topic. And once again, Travis and I are so thankful and honored that you came on our podcast with us, Greg. Thank you so much for
my pleasure.
Sharing all of your insights. Yeah. Where can our listeners find out more about you and learn from you? Because you have so much to teach and offer.
My website's just my name, greglehman.ca, and that's where I am on Twitter. That's normally the only two places I am. A little bit Instagram.
You're a little on it, yeah.
That's your skateboarding and gymnastics accidents.
It is.
And successes.
My narcissism platform.
I feel like
everybody has to have one.
Yeah.
The content you put on Instagram to me seems like it really shows you kind of building a bigger cup. Like seems like it's kind of about that, and then like your Twitter is like research and debate and
vitriol. Yeah.
I like both.
And drunken tweets that lead to podcast episodes.
Yeah, that's right.
Totally. Yeah, and also just a plug for your recovery strategies pain workbook. That's this free, amazing workbook that you wrote that's on your website. Anyone can download it. It's excellent for anyone in pain or not in pain who just wants to learn more about how pain works. Yeah. But that's like a great contribution that you... And you're also on YouTube. You're on YouTube. Don't forget to say that.
Oh, yeah. I'm doing more of that, but...
I want to... Your knee OA optimism?
I forgot about that. Yeah, there's that too.
OA is osteoarthritis.
Yeah.
So lots, and we'll link to all of that in the show notes. And we really encourage everybody to go follow Greg and learn from him, as Travis and I have. Yes. So thank both of you so much. This has been excellent. I've learned a ton just in talking to you, and I know that our listeners will as well. So thank you for being here today, Greg.
Again, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.